Good evening. My name is Michelle Stempian, Education and Community Programs Manager at the Holland Museum. Thank you for joining us this evening as we explore the history of African American quilt making here in Michigan. I would like to thank our Cultural Lens sponsors, Orwell Zeeland Hospital and Warner Norcross and Judd, with additional support from the Michigan Arts and Cultural Council and the National Endowment for the Arts. Before we begin, I have a few announcements and some information to share about the museum's current exhibition and some upcoming programs. First, please remain on mute throughout the presentation and type any questions you have into the chat, and we will share those questions at the end. Tonight's program will be recorded and will be posted to the museum's website in a few days. And even though we are not physically together this evening, I would like to take a moment to honor the space that the Holland Museum and the Capon and Settlers House Museums occupy. The Holland area surrounds Lake Makatawa, ancestrally known to the Potawatomi, Odawa, and Peoria nations as Mekatugami, or Black Lake. Each nation has their own rich cultural traditions and beliefs that still survive today. We, the Holland Museum, acknowledge that this land is sacred, and we commit to honoring the land and the indigenous peoples who have stewarded it for generations through continuing education, partnerships, and self-reflection. Thank you. Our current exhibition is Storied Objects, Folk Art from the Holland Museum Collection, featuring rarely seen folk art from the collection, including quilts, pottery, puppets, wood carvings, and basket weaving. Storied Objects demonstrates that folk art spans every culture across the globe, merging the utilitarian with the decorative, and reflects the heart of the community from which it comes. This exhibition will be on view until April 17th, and the museum's current hours are Mondays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 10 until 5. And we are always open the second Monday of the month in the evening from 4 to 7 for free. In fact, next Monday is our free second Monday, and we will be hosting a family Valentine's Day papermaking workshop from 4 to 7. You can learn the science behind papermaking and create a handmade paper Valentine with environmental artist Sandra Hansen. And this STEAM family program is free thanks to the Meyer Foundation. And on Thursday, February 16th at 7 p.m. in the Holland Museum Spark Lab, join Barbara Lee Van Horsen from the Momentum Center, along with previous Civil Rights Road Trip participants as they discuss their life-changing experiences in Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery, and Memphis. The 2023 Civil Rights Road Trip is scheduled from April 24th to April 27th. Program attendees will receive a discount on the trip if you register that evening. And you can learn more about these programs and many others, as well as register at hollandmuseum.org. And as we continue to offer these programs at little or no cost, so we can be as accessible as possible to the community, we hope you will support our efforts with the donation to the Holland Museum using the link on the screen. And thank you. Another way you can support the Holland Museum is by becoming a member. Family membership pays for itself in 2 visits, and members have unlimited access to the museum and both historic houses, as well as information about future programs and events. A premium membership includes the North American Reciprocal Museum Association, which includes access to over 1,000 museums and cultural institutions, as well as discounts. Contact the museum directly or access the museum website at hollandmuseum.org. So on to tonight's program. The history of African American quilting is rich and diverse. We are so fortunate to have with us Dr. Marsha McDowell as she highlights stories of this cultural activity in Michigan, from Idlewild to Detroit, from the time of slavery to today, from individual expressions to community collective work. Marsha McDowell, PhD, is professor and curator at Michigan State University Museum. She is the director of the Michigan Traditional Arts Program and the Quilt Index. She has published extensively on folk arts and quilts, including African American quilting in Michigan, and is currently heading an international effort funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities to increase African American, African, and African diasporic quilting content in the Quilt Index. Please welcome Dr. Marsha McDowell. Sorry, I muted you. Sorry, I muted you accidentally. Sorry about that.
So I'm now, accessible audibly, right?
Yes, you are. And you can
Okay.
go ahead and share your screen.
Okay. So I will share my screen in just a second, and I will just first say that I'm very thankful for this opportunity to be with all of you and to share information about a topic which I have spent years studying and am still enthused about investigating. So I will share my screen right now. We tested it earlier, and I'm hoping it will be okay again. Okay, let's see. Oh, let's see. I think it is looking fine. I just need to know how to, okay, I'm good. So, yes, so tonight I am talking on this topic that I've been investigating for many, many years, several decades, and the topic of African-American quilt making in Michigan is one that I hope tonight to draw back the curtains a little bit and talk about how this research has been done, not only by me, but by others in Michigan, and what we're doing in terms of documenting this history, preserving it, and then also creating digital access to this information. So I'll be talking a little bit about the Michigan Quilt Project in general, the African-American quilt emphasis in Michigan, a digital repository called the Quilt Index, and then, as was mentioned earlier, a new initiative called the Black Diaspora Quilt History Project. And I'll be highlighting some collections in Michigan that you will want to know about that are accessible to all of you. And then I'm going to show a sampling of quilts and talk a little bit about some of the stories of the artists and their own stories. So we'll just jump right into this. Okay, so I've got some notes here, so forgive me, but I need to make sure I've got my dates all correct. But I first want to talk about the fact that it was in the early 1980s that investigations about quilt history really jumped. There have been people investigating quilts and being involved in quilt studies for a number of years, but it was really in the 1980s that a systematic effort emerged across the country to look at quilts, who made them, when were they made, why were they made, etc. And so Michigan was one of the first states to be involved in this. And I'm showing the screen here to show a number of efforts that began to happen across the country. Pretty much what happened was that a basic form, a survey form, was developed, and it's got slight variations amongst all of the states, but essentially it was a form that recorded information about the technical aspects of the quilt, like what was the pattern name, how big was it, what were the materials, what were the colors that were evidenced in this quilt. And then there was information requested on the form about the artist who made the quilt. Who was the quilt maker? What was their name? Where were they from? Where were they born? Where did they live? What was their occupation? And then there was a section of the form that dealt with, well, what's the story about this quilt? Why was it made? And who has owned it? And what special occasions or meanings might be connected to that quilt? So Michigan started this, one of the first, as I said, first states to do this. And the effort was headquartered at Michigan State University Museum. In other states, it might have been headquartered at a library or maybe with just a group of volunteers. But typically, what happened was that a quilt discovery day. Oh, now have we lost the? Yeah, sorry. I want to make sure that I'm back to the. Yeah. So typically, what would happen was a quilt discovery day was held in a community, hosted by some local organization, a museum, a library, a quilt group, and at that day, quilts would be brought into a location and photographs would be taken of the quilt. Those forms I just described, those survey forms, would be filled out. And then maybe also a tape recorded interview was made with the either maker of the quilt or the owner of the quilt about that quilt history or the story of the quilters. Well, what was occurring is that in Michigan, I can tell you that there's almost 10,000 records of quilts made in Michigan that have been accumulated on those forums. And those are all in the Michigan State University Museum. But in other states, they might have been held by that volunteer group. And where were they stored? Maybe in a garage or in a basement. And they were in danger. All of that time and effort by hundreds of volunteers recording quilt history in the state was in jeopardy. And so a group of leaders of these state projects got together in the 1990s and said, we are worried that all of this documentation now of across the country, over 100,000 quilts, is in jeopardy. And we need to make sure that it was preserved. And then we want to make sure that it is made accessible, because even if it's preserved, like in a place like Michigan State University, 10,000 forms would not be very accessible, even if you came into the museum and wanted to use them for research purposes. So a group of individuals did get together and we said, what if we digitized all that information and put it online? We would be preserving it and we would be making it accessible. So in 1997, 1988, 1999, a group of individuals did get resources from the National Endowment for the Humanities to create what is now the Quilt Index, a digital repository that today has almost half of the state's records made available through this resource. And I'm just showing you a screenshot right now of the landing page of the Quilt Index. I'm the director of the Quilt Index. And you can now see, I'm pointing here with my pointer, you can see, you can search things by the quilt information, the name of the quilt, you can, by the story, by the name of the artist, by the collections. And I encourage you all to go online and just have fun playing with this. It's www.quiltindex.org. And we now have almost 100,000 quilts and related information about the artists who made them, their stories, etc. And they're from the state documentation projects as well as museum collections. I think we have about 25 museum collections from Michigan that are in this Quilt Index. So let me go to the next slide. Yeah, so here's the landing page for the Michigan Quilt Project. And again, you can see the URL for that landing page within the Quilt Index, and you can see all of the quilts that have been documented in Michigan. And you can search by not only the name of the person, but you can also search by location, like the county Holland, Michigan. You could search by Holland, Michigan, search by dates, by pattern name, etc. So it's great fun for research, for education, or maybe just for getting sparks of creativity ideas. But what we found out is that by working with local entities who were volunteering to work with the Michigan State University Museum, this is in the early mid 1980s, we realized that after conducting something like 30 of these quilt discovery days, it was only Western European oriented entities that were coming and asking to partner with us to do this community engaged research. We said, well, where are all of the African American quilts in this? Why are we not getting that data in here? And we realized that we had to be proactive and intentional in reaching out to African American communities. So we got some additional grants, and we then sought out partners, including everything from the mayor of Idlewild, Michigan, a historically important Black resort area in the lower part of the upper part of the Lower Peninsula. We held 2 quilt discovery days in Detroit with the African American Museum there in its early stages before it had its wonderfully big Wright museum. We held them in Kalamazoo with the Juneteenth celebration committee. We held our first one in Muskegon, Michigan, where we had worked with the Muskegon Community College Minority Affairs Office and the local 4-Hers. And we had, I think, 35 quilts were brought in, and the 4-Hers helped the owners of those quilts to fill out those forms. So we used a number of strategies to reach into communities and partner with communities to get this information and to make sure that we were looking holistically at the record of quilt making in Michigan. And what was lovely is that we just had the results of this documentation. It was amazing, and it showed that amongst the African Americans in Michigan, we had a very diverse gamut of quilt making activities. And let me just begin by showing you some examples of what was discovered. Do you note the name on this? Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks actually came to one of those quilt discovery days in Detroit. She was a seamstress. She was a quilt maker. And we found out that she actually regularly went to quilt events in the Detroit area. She brought in this quilt that she made to be documented, to be photographed, and to have the information about that quilt recorded in the Michigan Quilt Project. She also brought in a quilt made by her mother. So we were absolutely gobsmacked to be able to see that Rosa Parks was interested in this project, but it also provided evidence of the importance that she felt about quilt making in her own life experience. So here's another quilt made by Lula Williams, who received a Michigan Heritage Award for outstanding contributions to cultural traditions in Michigan. This is her quilt called I Am, and it alludes to passages in the Bible that I am the light of the world. I am the, and it speaks of her affiliation with her church in Detroit and her experience as a Christian woman and as a quilt maker. This one is a double wedding ring, and it was made by Zelma Doris, again of Detroit, Michigan, and made it circa 1985. And as we collected the stories and took these lovely, we sent out a photographer to take pictures in follow-up to those quilt discovery days. This was a photographer named Mary Whalen from Kalamazoo, Michigan, who visited each of the quilt makers in their homes, did these lovely portraits. And we got additional information from each of these artists after they filled out those original forms. Zelma's story was interesting in that it told of a family story that she had been raised in, I think it was South Carolina, in the South, where she had learned to quilt. And then she came to Detroit to find employment. Part of that upland migration to Michigan to find occupations in the factories here in Michigan. But she learned quilting in the South, and she was taught to always hold her needle pointing towards the north, because that is where opportunities would be for her and the family. Again, diversity here in terms of the ways in which African Americans have experience with quilting. Lethany Jones was a social worker in the Kalamazoo area, but she was also deeply involved in local theater productions as a costume creator, using her sewing skills. And at one point, she made this quilt, which she called Roadkill, and attached to a black background with skid marks made of Seminole style quilting strips. She affixed a number of stuffed but sort of flattened stuffed little toys, animals, as if they were smashed by the treads of tires going down the highway. So obviously she had a sense of humor. Beverly Ann White has brought in a quilt to the MSU Museum, which she gifted to the MSU Museum in the 90s. She made one in tribute, as have a number of quilt makers, African-American quilt makers in Michigan. She made one in tribute to African-American leaders historically. So, and the view from the mountaintop alludes to Martin Luther King. Again, variety here. Essie Lee Robinson from Detroit made this quilt out of blue jean pockets, cut out of blue jeans. So it's her pocket quilt. So it's a lovely, innovative use of recycling of materials. Rosie Lee Wilkins made this maple leaf quilt. She's from Muskegon, and we worked with Rosie several times, going and interviewing her, and she participated in a Smithsonian Institution major program in 1987, celebrating the state sesquicentennial, but she did not have visibility as a quilt artist within the Muskegon area until 2 years ago, when the Muskegon museum, the Lakeshore Museum, was interested in showcasing an exhibition of quilts made locally. And I suggested to them that they investigate Rosie Lee Wilkins. And they did an exhibition 2 years ago of the quilts of Rosie Wilkins. I think that the exhibit title was "Who is Rosie Lee Wilkins?" And they did additional research on her, and a really lovely circumstance happened in that it turned out that somebody working at the Lakeshore Museum was actually Rosie Lee Wilkins' granddaughter. And there's a little inset piece on her, and she became an important informant to sharing stories about her grandmother, and was a very beautiful sort of circle of life here. The mother and daughter team here, another example of a type of quilt making, is Deanna Green on the right and her mother, Ione Todd, who are from Remus, Michigan, in Mecosta County. Deanna and Ione made this Todd family quilt, which chronicled the 6 generations of, the story of Stephen and Caroline Todd, and then the 6 generations of the Todd family as they migrated from Kentucky into Michigan, mid-Michigan, and set down roots. I don't have details to show you right here, but I can tell you that each one of these blocks is an element that shares stories about the family. Some blocks simply have names of family members emanating out from the center with Stephen and Caroline's image and radiating out with the generations. But some blocks, like this block right here, is a depiction of a family story that Stephen and Caroline escaped from Kentucky slavery and fled to Michigan, Port Huron, and then crossed from Port Huron to Canada at the moment at which horses, riders on horses, trailing them, trying to capture them, were right there at the shoreline, and they escaped by a raft. So this family story now is preserved not only in oral tradition, but in this visual depiction that is placed on this quilt. The research on this quilt is mostly done by Deanna Green, and she visits archives. She talks to archives in Michigan, archives in Washington, D.C. She talks to family members, and in this quilt, she records that history. She tells me that she uses just embroidery thread, one strand, to write out all of the letters that copy a document. And it can take her 100 hours just to make one block. So an incredible dedication to preserving her own family's history. She has made 3 versions of this quilt. We own one at Michigan State University. She's also made quilts that depict the history of Idlewild or Black heroes also. She's got a great body of work. So the research that we did on African American quilting resulted in an exhibition and then in this publication. And I just want you to take a look at this graphic here that was the cover of the book that we published at that time. And I'm later on going to show you an image of the person who made the quilt that is excerpted here. So we had probably 15 years of research on African American quilting in Michigan. And as a result of that, because there weren't similar efforts going on in other states looking particularly at African American quilts, we started to get inquiries from across the country of people who were interested in this topic. And I have to say that Questa Benberry, a woman, African American woman who was had a master's in library science at from Missouri. She lived in St. Louis, who was one of the founding members of the American Quilt Study Group. She was one of the pioneers of American quilt study in general, but she was the pioneer of African American quilt history. So she donated, she and her family donated her collection of quilts and all of her 80 boxes, banker boxes of research data to Michigan State University Museum. So that actually really launched a huge repository of information, adding on to the documentation that we had on African American quilts just in Michigan. I'm showing you here on this slide the one and only quilt that actually Questa had a hand in making. And the quilt itself is made up of blocks that are referencing different aspects of African American quilt history that she herself as a researcher was interested in. And off to the side, there's a picture that was just made in the last 2 weeks of Questa. That's this composite collage picture of her was made by my colleague, Dr. Liv Furman, who is working with me on this new initiative on Black diaspora quilt history. So, yeah, so that quilt is in the MSU Museum collection, and the reference quilt index URL down at the bottom is, you could actually go right to the quilt index and see that quilt and read more about it. Well, that led to yet another quilt collection, major quilt collection being given to Michigan State University. Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi, who got her PhD in aeronautics engineering, at a time when not many women, very few women were making or getting that kind of a degree, but she was an African American woman getting a degree in aeronautics engineering. So she had a long career in that field, but she also was interested in textiles, came from a family where there were quilts, and she founded an organization called the Women of Color Quilters Network. A few years ago, she gifted the MSU Museum with a collection of quilts that she had amassed of quilts made by members of that organization. It's coupled with the Questa Benberry quilt, which is more historical. This more contemporary collection means that we have a really nice gamut of materials for people to do research on. It included a quilt made by her, but this quilt right here, the Black Family Series 1, is one of the series of quilts that Carolyn has made. This one was actually in the collection of Questa Benberry, who was gifted to us. Should say that Dr. Mazlumi has been honored more recently with some major national awards. She's a National Heritage Fellow. She's gotten one of the USA artist fellowships. And she is now almost working exclusively in Black and white. She's also doing some amazing work with social justice and human rights quilts. In fact, in response to the killing of George Floyd, she organized a major exhibition of quilts that dealt with police brutality. And then Dr. Mazlumi was instrumental in the university getting the papers of Dr. Gladys Marie Fry, who was like one of the scholars on slave-made quilts. And Dr. Fry was at the very first quilt discovery day that we did in Michigan at Muskegon. She's passed away, but Carolyn worked with her family to get the papers, her research papers and interviews given to Michigan State. So I say this as to let people know that we've got a good body of work, a body of materials, of resources that are there at Michigan State that can be used for anybody who's interested in digging in deeper into aspects of African-American quilt history. So now I'm just going to show you some non-Michigan quilts that are in our collection, some favorite ones. And earlier, there was a slide at the beginning showing Rosa Parks, the statue of Rosa Parks in the bus. And here is a quilt made by a woman who was born in Michigan, Detroit, now lives in Texas. And she did this rendition of a quilt as part of a series of quilts that were done for exhibition on quilts related to Barack Obama that Dr. Carolyn Mazlumi organized. And here is Carolyn's rendition where Mrs. Parks is in the bus and outside is Michelle and Barack. Another really amazing quilt that is in the collection at Michigan State is one called Lazy Man. It was designed by Ruth Clement Bond and then quilted by Rose Marie Thomas. There are about 6 or 7 of those quilts that were made in this particular pattern. We think it references the artist Aaron Douglas. This quilt shows the hand of government pressing against a Black man who is interested in music, holding guitar. And so it's thought that this alludes to the fact that the government was pushing Black men as maybe being lazy, stereotypically thinking they were lazy, but it was just a statement of the time. And yet the man was creative and had a sense of purpose himself. Inset into this slide I'm showing you are other renditions of that same quilt. These quilts are owned by other individuals, institutions across the country. And I've given you the Quilt Index link there. You can go into the Quilt Index and compare and contrast. You can choose several quilts from different collections that are dispersed across the country and then be able to see them all in one place. I think this is a really interesting way of seeing how one artist, one designer, and a quilter collaborating can make something that is the same but slightly different. By the way, Ruth Clement Bond is the aunt of the well-known activist Julian Bond. Ruth was married to a man who worked for the Tennessee Valley Authority, and together they went to Liberia, where Mr. Bond, her husband, became the president of the University of Liberia. Ruby Bridges, What a Difference a School Makes, is a quilt that was made by Marion Coleman, who also was a National Heritage Fellow, who sadly passed away a couple of years ago. She did these narrative quilts, these pictorial quilts that were focused on famous figures in African American history. And this one, we have a interview with Marion Coleman that I did. It's in the MSU Museum collections, and we have 2 or 3 quilts made by Marion Coleman. Exceptional artist. This quilt here is by it's not in our collection. We have it documented though. It's made by April Shipp, who recently retired from Chrysler in Detroit. This is an amazing piece. It's huge, and it was recently on display in Grand Rapids as part of Art Prize. April did research to find the names of people who had been lynched between the dates 1865, 1965. And then state by state, she machine embroidered their names on this huge piece. And we have a great interview of her talking about how troubling it was to her to make this quilt, including at the end attaching 2 human-sized nooses at the top of the quilt. It is very emotional to be able to stand in front of this quilt. It evokes, it triggers emotions. And so, yeah, she's a very special person. And now I'm looping back to the excerpt of the image of the book on African American quilting in Michigan, and that quilt that we used on the cover was made by Carol Harris, who I first met in 1975 when she did an exhibition of quilts in Detroit. And I want to refer you to her because she is been consistently active over these almost 50 years in making quilts and has several exhibitions. I know she's had ones at the Dennis Museum in the last year and a half, and she's got 2 or 3, I think now some in New York, but she is constantly making quilts that are not designed for the bed, but have always been viewed as quilts made for the wall, for architectural installations, and she's just sort of a genius in making work. So now I've got, just looking at the clock here, we've got about 15 minutes left. I just want to show you this slide because we're now working with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities on what is called a Black Diaspora Quilt History Project. We're working with a number, like 18 museums across the country, 6 museums in South Africa, and scholars of Liberian quilting, Egyptian quilting, to get their collections into the Quilt Index so that we really have a good, strong hub of information about this realm of artistic, expressive cultural history. This slide, again, was made by my colleague, Dr. Furman, and we are aggressively working with all of these organizations to put the digital information, photographs, tape recorded interviews, et cetera, into the index so that we have this strong record of African and African American history. And this then shows the production of quilts in Michigan in this larger context. So I've run very quickly through a series of slides here, and I've not done anything deeply about any one of those individuals, which I could talk about at length. But what I wanted to simply convey is that by looking at objects, by collecting stories, by getting information about artists, investigating collections, that we can begin to aggregate a picture of African American quilting in general, but certainly in Michigan. So I thank you just for letting me share some of this history and drawing the curtains back about how some of the research is done and sharing some of these resources with you. And there's the URL for the Quilt Index. And by the way, my plug is that there's also little buttons when you go on the Quilt Index that you could donate. And importantly, with a new tool that we've created and launched in this last year, you could sit at your computer, and if you have a quilt and you want to tell your own story, you can upload it into the Quilt Index. Okay, I think I'm going to dissolve my PowerPoint now, and let's see, get out of it. I'm going to stop sharing. Yes. And
thank you so much, Marcia. First of all, I just want to say thank you for sharing all this information and these stories and these incredible images with us. Those quilts were stunning and powerful. And also just thank you for all the work that you've done and so many have done to preserve this information and this history, which is so very important. So I'm just so thrilled that you were here to share this all with us tonight. So
love working on this stuff.
It shows that you do. So for all of our visitors here this evening, if you have a question for Marcia, please go ahead and put it into the chat. And we have a comment that that's lovely. So I don't know, I'm assuming it's kind of the whole thing, and the presentation as well as the topic. But if you have a question, please put it in the chat and we can share it with Marcia and she would be happy to answer it. I was going to ask you, Marcia, is while we're waiting for people to put it in the chat, and I'm sure this is like asking if you have a favorite child, but do you have a favorite quilt?
Oh, well, I do. I have, and I almost showed a picture of it, but I didn't. But I have done a lot of research in South Africa over 20 years, and I've got a book ready. It will be published I hope by the end of the year by Indiana University Press. But there's a quilt that I saw probably about 15, 16 years ago that was made by two sisters who live in Soweto. And it has pictures of the, it's head portraits in cloth of some of the Black South African women activists, anti-apartheid activists. And so we were able to acquire one of that quilt, a quilt from the two women, Fina Nkosi and her sister Phyllis Sulu, for the MSU Museum. So we have that. And then about 5 years later, I saw a second version of that quilt that they made. And I bought it for myself personally. And it's hanging in my living room. So I see it every single day. And I feel like those women are like with me, supporting me. And yeah, so there you go.
Great. I love that. Okay, so we have a question from Donna. What is the range of dates in the index? What is the oldest quilt?
Oh my God, that is a great question for which I do not have a great answer. We'll go into the Quilt Index and you can search by dates. And so I should have at my fingertips that answer, but I don't. But I know it goes back into the 1800s.
Okay. And from Ricky, how many are in the current collection? So, I mean, are you, Ricky, I'm assuming you mean the MSU collection. So how many quilts are in the MSU?
I should know that question too, that answer. I think it's about 1,000. I can say that we have probably one of the best African-American quilts in the world. There are some museums that have more, but they don't show the diversity that I've just shown you with these images. They may be all one style, like strip quilts or Africa, like a G's Bend kind of quilt, but no, the true picture of the history is that it has been the kinds of quilts that are made are as diverse as African Americans are.
Right. Well, and you're still collecting, so you have contemporary quilts as well as historical examples. So yes. Mary's put in a statement and a question. I was involved with registering quilts into the Quilt Index years ago with the West Michigan Quilt Guild. Glad to know it's still so vital. Thank you. Are the quilts from the Grand Rapids Museum in the index?
Oh, you need to go into the Quilt Index and just check. If they are not, harass the Grand Rapids Museum to make sure that happens. Just as I'm now live harassing the Holland Museum to make sure that their quilts are in the collection too.
I know. I was just thinking that. We have a couple up right now, and there's still some still in storage. I was like, oh my gosh, if they're not in here, we need to do that. So
yeah, exactly.
On the list.
What's fun is for a museum like the Holland Museum to be able to see their collections in the same space as every other collection. And if you want to do investigation on your quilts, you can then compare and contrast them. It's that little compare button tool that we have in the Quilt Index that I use all the time.
Great. Any other questions for Marcia? Give everyone another minute or so.
Well, I'll just say a little bit more about our collections. Because so many museums do have collections. We have really focused at Michigan State University Museum on developing collections with point of view. African-American quilts are a strength of our collection. We have a lot of Michigan quilts. We also, though, have been developing collections that deal with human rights and social justice over many years. We partnered with the National Museum of the American Indian about 20 years ago to do research on indigenous quilts. And we, as a result of that, amassed a collection of indigenous quilts that, like the African-American quilts, shows the diversity of engagement with quilting amongst everyone's from Inuit to Seminoles. And then we're also developing a collection of quilts that have to do with health and how health and well-being and quilting are so tied together.
Wow, interesting. So we did get another question. Do most current quilters still use found materials to piece the quilts?
All right. So here's truth be told. I've made one quilt in my life. So I'm more interested as a scholar in not the how to, but the stories about the artists who made them and the quilt history itself. But that said, that question about whether using hand or using found materials to piece quilts or not, I think that there wouldn't be the quilt world business industry that is constantly creating new fabrics and selling fabrics that are being purchased along with all of the sewing machines and gadgets, etc., that support quilt making. If people were only recycling old patches of material, that industry wouldn't exist.
Yeah, my mom has so much fabric. She just keeps
Yes, I mean,
more and more fabric.
those stashes are out there.
Yes,
And-
they are.
And I think there, every few years there's been a study of the quilting in the US, and it's amazing how much money is spent, how many people are involved in some aspect of quilt making, and how much money individuals pay, spend on new fabric and patterns and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And those stashes do exist.
Yes, they do. Question from Bridget, kind of going back to the searching. So she said to find the quilts for the Grand Rapids Art Museum, would we look under institution in the search? Because she says they appear not to be listed. So she was just wondering, would you look under like?
Yeah, and anybody could email me. It's MacDowell, MacDowell @msu.edu. And if you've done due diligence already searching for it in the Quilt Index, send me a note and I'll take a look and see if it's hidden. With almost 100,000 quilts in the Quilt Index, even with the search tools that we have, sometimes it is frustrating trying to find it, but you have to, use several attempts to find it. I will tell you, if you go under collections on the Quilt Index, a drop down box, then there is another drop down box to look at. You can put in the museums. You can also go to that slide I showed you earlier that shows just the Michigan Quilt Project. And if a quilt was documented that is in a museum collection and it was part of the Michigan Quilt Project, it should be there. And we provide then a landing page for each museum that has more than one quilt.
Great. Thank you so much. Any other questions? Oh, yes. Ricky was reminding me that when we send the recording of this program, Marcia is going to be sending us this PowerPoint presentation and the links that we've been talking about. So we will be sending those out with the recording and an evaluation of the program. So you will all receive that information. So, okay. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in. So I think, and it's 8 o'clock. So I think we're going to go ahead and close. We got to thank you. Wonderful program. So I'm going to echo that as well. Thank you again so much, Marcia. It was an incredible program. I learned so much tonight, and I hope everyone goes out and checks out this Quilt Index and all of these amazing resources that are available. And thank you so much again, Marcia, and thank you everyone else for being here this evening. And we hope you all have a good night.
Thank you again. And it was a pleasure. And yeah, quilts are great.
Yes, they are. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night.